Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of our double bill today. And if you didn't see the show earlier with Kathy Wilson, it was absolutely outstanding. We looked at General Frank Andrews, and it was fantastic. Lots of talk about leadership and Eisenhower and Hap Arnold. Anyway, check it out and watch it. But today, right now, we are looking at the preparation for Operation Overlord once again. Today, we focus on the US 1st Infantry Division, who, unlike the 29th, which we talked about yesterday with Joe, Joe's in the sidebar. Good evening, Joe, or good afternoon. The first, of course, have been in numerous campaigns before June 1944. My guest is historian and Army veteran Stephen Clay. I'll bring him in now. Hello, Stephen. How are you today?
Better than I deserve, as usual.
As usual. So, Joe set it all up yesterday with the 29th Division. You can't talk about the 29th without talking about the 1st. So, totally different experience before in the previous, 2 or 3 years. And so we'll go through that now. But before we start that, what have you been up to the last month since I spoke to you last?
What have I been up to? Well, on a research basis, history basis, I won't get into all the other crap I'm doing on my house, but I wrote a 4-volume set on the order of battle of the U.S. Army from 1919 to 1941, and that got published by the Combat Studies Institute a number of years ago. And I am currently working on a similar effort that covers the order of battle of the U.S. Army from 1945 to 1965. And I picked peacetime periods because most of the wartime periods have been covered. And if you have most people serve in peacetime, and if you have a relative, a dad or an uncle or somebody that served in peacetime, it's hard to find out what the heck the unit did. And so I'm putting that together so people can use that as a reference to help them put together family histories or whatever it is that they're going to do with it. So, in fact, I'll be heading to the Center of Military History later this month for 3 or 4 days to dig through all their unit data cards and other things to continue that process.
Who doesn't love a good day in the archives? Anyway, we'll bring up your PowerPoint. So, folks, we'll kind of do questions as we go along, and Steve will tell me when to move on the next slide. But we're looking at the 1st Division for those 7 months up before June 1944. So, over to you, Stephen.
Okay, well, if you can go ahead and move to the next slide, slide 2. These are the things I'm going to kind of cover for the benefit of your listeners there. I do want to start back early on to kind of bring the 1st Division forward for some people who may not know what the 1st Division. I'm not going to talk a lot. I just want to kind of bring the story forward to getting to England in November 1943. The division, after it leaves the States, it gets on the HMS Queen Mary and arrives in England on the 8th of August 1942, and it moves to Tidworth Barracks. And that's where it basically trains and prepares to go to North Africa. Lands at Oran on the 8th of November 1942, is there till May of 43 at the end of the Tunisian campaign. And then, of course, they prepare for and conduct an amphibious operation at Gela, Sicily, 10 July. And they finish up their fighting in Sicily on the 6th of August, 1943. So that kind of takes you through the war and explains, how we're going to end up going to England in the first place. And then I'll talk, like I say, if you take a look at the rest of those things, it's mostly going to be focused on what happens to the 1st Infantry Division in England. And because I'm a 16th Infantry guy, most of my references is going to be focused on what the 16th Infantry did, but you can apply that pretty much across the board for the rest of the division. So anyway, if we can go ahead and go to slide 3, I want to talk a little bit about the personality of the 1st Division, because when we talked in our Sicily podcast, I addressed some of these things, and this is where things start to change for the 1st Division. The fighting at Troina ends on the 6th of August. And on the 7th of August, Terry Allen and Teddy Roosevelt, the division commander and the ADC, are relieved of their commands. Now, they're not relieved for cause. They're relieved officially because they're tired and we need to move them out of the position, get fresh blood in there. But the whole thing was a very big shock to the soldiers of the 1st Division, because they loved Terry Allen and Teddy Roosevelt. They were a great command team. They felt like they took care of the troops and so forth. Now, as you well know, the blame falls on George Patton, although he's really not the bad guy in this story. In fact, Patton and Terry Allen are both cavalrymen, and they had a great deal of respect for each other. And although Patton agreed that Terry Allen was getting tired, it's probably time for him to move out, it was really Bradley, Omar Bradley, who was the guy that was responsible for moving them out. And he gives that very argument. Hey, these guys are tired. We need to get fresh blood in there. But there's a fair amount of evidence that he was very irritated with Terry Allen and Teddy Roosevelt over what happened in North Africa regarding the inability of the First Division soldiers to be able to go into the towns to enjoy some, a little bit of beer and chasing women or whatever. They had, as your listeners probably know, or at least many of them know, that the combat soldiers were forbidden from going in because they didn't have khakis with a tie and all that kind of stuff. And so it was all the rear echelon troops that got to have the rest and relaxation while they were out there in pup tents and whatever. So that caused a lot of animosity toward Patton and to a degree toward Omar Bradley. But of course, Patton's the 7th Army commander. He makes the decision. He gets the blame from the soldiers. Now, the guy replacing Terry Allen, and I should say the guys they're replacing Terry Allen and Roosevelt are Major General Clarence Huebner and Brigadier General Willard Wyman. And in fact, on the 7th of August, the day after, technically the day after Allen's relieved, he takes Huebner and Wyman to the 16th Infantry Regimental headquarters in Rowena to meet the troops and so forth. And they get there and they talk to the troops. And one of the things that Allen says, and I'll quote him here, he says, "The Battle of Rowena was by far the toughest battle we've had, far tougher than any in Africa. I'm proud of the tenacity of the 16th, the indomitable spirit each man has shown and is still showing. You are to be congratulated for a truly great performance." So you can imagine that, Terry Allen coming there after he's been relieved, hearing this from their, the soldiers hearing this from their commander, makes it even harder for them to accept the idea that, this guy's going. Now, Huebner and Wyman. Huebner becomes nicknamed the coach. And the reason why is because he's a trainer. He and Wyman are really going to do a great job getting the First Division ready for D-Day, and I'll cover that as part of this presentation. Huebner is a former First Division guy, though. He served in every grade, officer grade, in the division with the exception of Brigadier General. So he knows the division. People know him, but he's never going to have quite the same level of love of the soldiers, but he's certainly going to gain their confidence as he goes through the process of getting them ready for D-Day.
Do we know if he was aware at the time? Does he know he's going in kind of as not the favored person? I'm thinking it's similar to when Maxwell Taylor joins the 101st from the 82nd, having replacing Bill Lee. He knows he's going in as everyone doesn't like him. So does Huebner, is he aware of that? If he is aware, does he care?
I can't answer any specifics. Here's what I would say is that he's going back to the First Division.
Yeah.
And if you know people from the First Division, it's like guys who served the 101st or the 1st Cav, whatever. You want to go back to your division because that's the division you know the history, people in it because people do multiple tours in their division, so to speak. So there's no doubt in my mind he's happy about going back.
Right.
Whether he feels like he's going to get some initial pushback from people, I don't know. I just don't know, but I'm fairly confident he's pretty happy about going back to the First Division now.
Okay,
on a
thanks.
personal level. Okay, and as I say, he's gonna gain the trust and confidence of the division pretty quickly. Anyway, by the way, I'll point out to him, he actually briefly commanded the 16th Infantry as a major in 1919, right after World War I, for a brief period. So he's even been a first 16th Infantry guy. Okay, let's go. One other point I'll point out to you real quick is that George Taylor is still the regimental commander of the 16th, and I'll talk about Colonel Taylor because he is going to gain the same level of trust and confidence of the 16th Infantry. In fact, he's already in the process of doing that at this point. He took over it in North Africa and has done a superb job all the way through to this point, and the troops are going to just love him just that much more, particularly because of the way he's going to treat them in England. Right. Okay, let's go ahead and go to slide 4. Picture of Sicily here to kind of so you can see the movements. 14th of August, right after Torina, the regiment and most of the division moves to the vicinity of what's called a Randazzo, right there on the slopes of Mount Etna. There, they're going through the process of refitting and conducting repairs, replacing equipment, all that kind of stuff. And then about a week later, on the 20th, they move to Licata, if I'm pronouncing that right. And there they go through several weeks, really about a month of rest, relaxation, but also training, which I'll address again here a little bit. While they're there on the 27th of August, Patton comes to visit the regiment. Now, this is part of the apology tour. For those people who are familiar with the movie Patton, they'll remember the scene where he goes and slaps a soldier in the field hospital for being a coward. What was called shell shock in World War I, and now called World War II anyway, called combat exhaustion. And he's got to go. He gets chastised by Eisenhower, and he's got to go to apologize to all the soldiers about his treatment of this. Actually, it happened, I think, a couple of times.
Yeah.
But so Captain Fred Hall, who was a company commander of the 16th, records his impressions of the event. And this is what he wrote. He wrote, "Close by our area was a hillside which formed a natural amphitheater, at the bottom of which had been built a platform for staging various events. The division was gathered on a hillside and addressed by General Patton, who congratulated us for a job well done and then apologized for what had transpired and regretted his action," which, of course, is about the slapping incident. "He was not popular in the 1st Division, and his appearance was greeted with stony silence." And I use that term, where he uses this term, stony silence, but it's not the first time you're going to hear it in relation to Patton, as you'll see here in a little bit. At this point in September, General Hubner starts to reinstitute training. Okay, they pulled him out of combat. You've had roughly a month of rest and relaxation and refitting and so forth. And now we're going to go back to training. So what does he do? Well, he has these combat veterans start doing things like basic rifle marksmanship. He, is doing basic instruction in drill and ceremonies, wear the uniform, hand salute, guard mount, those types of things, which to combat soldiers are kind of like, what are we doing this for? They're scratching their head and getting kind of irritated that they're having to do all this basic soldier stuff. Well, what is Hubner doing? Well, he's enforcing his will on the division. He realizes he's got to get control of these guys and get them to do what he wants them to do when they need to do it. And that's the way he starts the process. It's also a process of trying to integrate any new soldiers coming in the division on the 1st Division way of doing stuff, which every division does things a little bit differently, even all these things. Now, I'd like to address that integration process a little bit. And we talked about before the show, Greg Fontenot's new book on the No Sacrifice to Great. And that's one of the things that Greg talks about is what do we learn in combat and how do we apply those lessons learned to our training for the next big show? And one of the things that he addresses in there is how the 1st Division integrated new soldiers. Now, there's a popular impression that I think may be overblown a little bit, but it's certainly true, where certain divisions, certain units had this reluctance to embrace new soldiers because the feeling was these are new guys. Most of the people who get killed and wounded in combat are green soldiers that do something stupid. And if you get to know these guys and they get killed, you feel bad. So if you don't get to know them, you don't feel anything. And so they tend to be standoffish. Well, that's not the policy in the 1st Division. The policy was integrate these guys, make them part of the team. Now, I'm sure some of that went on in the 1st Division, hither and yon, but that wasn't the policy. It was to get these guys integrated. And I think by and large, the 1st Division did a pretty darn good job of doing that sort of thing. And of course, that's going to pay big dividends in places like Omaha Beach, where you have to act on your own with your team. Okay, so by mid-October, things are starting to percolate there on Sicily, and they realize the division is about to move again. And sure enough, on the 15th, the division advance party moves to the port of Augusta, way over on the east side of the island. And there, on the 23rd, the rest of the regiment arrives. I'm not sure. I don't know this. I should have looked it up, but I didn't. Whether the whole division's on the Majola or the Maloja, I don't think so. I think there's different regiments on different ships. Anyway, the 16th goes boards the HMS Maloja. If you can go to the next slide, that's the ship. That's the Maloja. That's the ship that they boarded, and they're sitting in the harbor right on the 23rd. Hubner had gotten word from Patton that, hey, I'm gonna come out there on a skiff, and I'm gonna wave to the troops and bid them farewell and so forth. So if you can have them up on up on the railings to say goodbye, I'd appreciate it. So Hubner calls in Wyman and says, hey, we got to get the division or the regiment up, the troops up to the railings to wave to General Patton. And Wyman says, sir, we can get them up there, but I don't think you're going to hear any cheering. Now Hubner knows Patton; they know each other. They're friends, if you will. And Wyman goes, Huber goes, no, they're over that. They'll cheer. Well, they get them up there, and Patton floats around, going from ship to ship, waving at people. And what does he meet? Stony silence. Nobody cheers or anything. So I often wonder, what is Patton thinking at this point? Why is he getting the silent treatment of the 1st Division? Of course, that's thanks to Omar Bradley. Right, so they set sail and they head out. And initially, everybody on board, at least the troops, think they're heading for Italy. Now, Italy hasn't kicked off yet, but it's about to. All the signs are there for that. And so the belief kind of was, well, we're not an assault ship, so we're probably going to, wait till the initial invasion, then pull into a harbor and disembark and head out to our assembly area or whatever. But that's what they think they're going to do, is they're heading for Italy. Well, in essence, what happens is the convoy turns and they head off to Algiers, where they arrive for a very brief period on the 26th of October. And there they load aboard a bunch of British passengers. Now, most of these guys are British officers and their families. I suspect many of them were guys that had been stationed like in Egypt and everything, where they had families there, but now they're going home to England on reassignment or whatever. And there's a number of enlisted men on board the ship as well. And initially, between the U.S. troops and the British soldiers, there's kind of this standoffishness until the pets and the kids show up on the deck. And all of a sudden, you have all these American soldiers going over to say hi to the kids and give them candy and, from their sea rations and gum and pet the dogs and all. And that kind of breaks the ice. So from that point on, the voyage is pretty pleasant between the two groups. They head west and they go through the Straits of Gibraltar and head out into the Atlantic, because they're not going to, swing by too closely to Portugal and Spain. And so next big rumor is, hey, we're headed back to the States. So everybody's all happy they're heading back to the States. Well, after a day or two, all of a sudden they see this one transport heading west, right? And it turns out it was an Italian transport for some reason. I guess they'd commandeered it or whatever. And the rest of the convoy kind of makes that right turn and starts heading north. And at that point, everybody's kind of like, okay, we're not heading to the States. Where could we be going? Well, there's only one place, and that is merry old England. Okay, so in his book, which I have right here, A Doctor's War, Major, later Colonel, there we go, A Doctor's War, by Major Charles Techmeyer. He was the regimental surgeon. And by the way, a guy named Dr. Sanders Marble, who's the command historian for the medical command down at Fort Sam Houston. He and I were the editors for that book, and I really enjoyed doing the editing for that book. It's fascinating, and I recommend it to your readers. Anyway, having said that, he basically makes the quote in this book. He says, "Well, if we can't go back to the States, England is the next best place. So they're pretty happy about going there and being able to talk to people that they can hobble with and not have to try to learn, Arabic or Italian or whatever. Anyway, after about 2 weeks at sea, they get to Liverpool, where they arrive on the 4th of November. And the 16th Infantry, again, I'm not sure about the rest of the division, but the 16th Infantry remains on board the ship until the evening of the 5th of November. So they're there for a day, and they're not letting them off the ship yet. And that has to do with security. They disembark about 2130 that night. And everything, there's military police all over the harbor area, and it's very tightly controlled because I don't want anybody sneaking out and trying to go to a pub in Liverpool. And they herd them into a warehouse there where General Hubner is there to talk to them. And he gives them a pep talk. And, one of the first things he says is, oh, by the way, we're not going to Italy. And everybody, cheers for that. But he goes on to say, however, we are going on to the next big fight. And you know where that is. And we're going to train like never before. And that really is kind of true. He's really going to put him through the ropes in England to prepare for D-Day. And I'll talk again, of course, about the training. Very tightly controlled movement onto the trains. The soldiers, while they were on board ship, were told to remove all their 1st Division patches, all the insignia on their helmets, all the bumper numbers on their vehicles and so forth. And if anybody asked them, they're to tell them we're from the 314th Anti-Air Force Regiment, which is a bizarre. I mean, there's no such thing as an anti-air force regiment. Anti-aircraft artillery battalion maybe, but that's what they're told to tell people. So they board these blacked out trains and they rail from Liverpool down to a place called Beminster in Dorset County, which is where they're going to end up being stationed. Let's go ahead and next slide. And you can kind of see there where the 1st Division is in relation to southern part of England and the other divisions that are there for D-Day purposes. Now, go back again real quick. When the 1st Division comes to England in August of 1942, they're at Tidworth Barracks. That's their station when they're preparing to go to North Africa. And while they're there, there's very few American troops in England at that point. And what are there besides the 1st Division are, London or that area. And there's virtually nobody around in Tidworth. So they're used to just kind of being there by themselves. Well, by the time they get there in November of 43, the place is packed with Americans. American troops, American vehicles, American planes, they're just all over the place. And in fact, as I understand it, there were more American troops in England at the time than there were British and Commonwealth troops. So that kind of gives you an idea the number of
my grandmother certainly said it felt like it.
Yeah, exactly. Now, as you can see, the way they place the divisions in southern England, logically, as it turns out, and it makes no real surprise, I don't think, is based on where they were going to be landing in Normandy. Okay, so you can see the 1st Division is going to go into Omaha Beach, so they're right there at Weymouth. Load there, move to Omaha, relatively short voyage. The one exception, I think Joe Balkowski may have addressed this, I don't know, is they're way out there near Falmouth for some reason. And Joe could probably address why they're out there. But they end up, loading out at Falmouth and linking up with the Corps, 5th Corps convoy there coming into Omaha Beach from there. Other than that, everybody's kind of pretty much close to where they're going to land. The 2nd wave divisions are farther north. You can see the 2nd Infantry Division, 90th Division up there north of the Bristol Channel. You got the 51st British Division, 49th up there farther northeast of London. And then, of course, the 101st and the 82nd are up there north at Airfield, so it doesn't matter. They're going to fly in and jump in anyway. So, again, it makes sense the way they brought everybody in. You can tell everybody they've been planning. This isn't going to be at least it's going to start out orderly and logical. Okay, let's go ahead. Next slide. Wicker down to the 1st Division area. Here again, this is the Dorset County area where the 1st Division is. You can see there, kind of the upper right-hand corner of the slide, you'll see where the 1st Division headquarters was, right there at Blandford Forum. That's where the division headquarters was. The division artillery was located kind of in the north part up there. That's the Sagittarius with the red moon there. That represents a couple of the regiments that were in the division artillery historically. But really, the only thing that's there with the division artillery headquarters is the 33rd Field Artillery, which was the division general support battalion, the 155 artillery. And then I believe some other artillery elements that are going to be attached out to the 1st Division for the purposes of D-Day as well. But the division support artillery battalions are actually farmed out to the 3 regiments already. So they're in with the infantry regiments. Those being the 26th Infantry in the east, there at East Stoke. That's where their regimental headquarters was. The 18th Infantry at Puddletown. And I'd like to know the history behind that name one of these days. I'm very curious about that. And of course, the 16th Infantry is out there in the west, there in red at Beminster. So that's where the division goes. And again, most of what I'm going to talk about will be focused on the 16th Infantry. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and that'll show you the 16th Infantry. That's a pretty busy slide there that kind of tells you where all the different elements were for the regiment. The regimental headquarters being at Beminster, and then what is kind of typically called the special troops, the anti-tank company, the cannon company, and the medical detachment, which was really a company-size organization, is all there at Beminster. 1st Battalion was in at Lyme Regis in the west, 2nd Battalion at Bridport with some companies in Walditch, and then the 3rd Battalion is out there at Lytton Cheney with line companies out in different communities east of there. So that's where the 16th Infantry is, just kind of northwest of Weymouth and west of Dorchester. One of the interesting and kind of funny things is when the regiment gets into this area, of course, they're playing the game, no patches, no insignia, no bumper numbers, all that kind of stuff. And they come in, and as they start to rub elbows with the local population, the curiosity always bubbles up, questions start being asked and so forth. And when they start telling people, yeah, we're with the 314th Anti-Aircraft or Anti-Air Force Regiment, they usually got an answer that went something like this: "Posh, you're with the 1st Infantry Division. We know who you guys are. We've been waiting for you since September." So much for the security. People already knew who these guys were, and so forth. So I thought that was kind of funny.
Just to say, Stephen, we have an answer for you. The wonderful Merrin Walters is saying the name Puddletown means farmstead on the River Piddle. It derives from the Old English Piddell, a river name meaning fen or marsh, and tun meaning farmstead. Well, there you are. Every day's a school day.
Hey, exactly. It ain't a good day unless you've learned something. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay. Just as a sidebar, you run across not exactly that type of stuff, but you run across a lot of British names here in the United States for various and sundry reasons. And every now and then you'll run into a place that's named kind of like that, and you just kind of scratch your head and go, logically that's somewhere from over there. Originally, some guy probably renamed it that from where
when all the Brits moved to the US, they weren't very imaginative with names. They just took their name from Cambridge and Boston and Ipswich and Colchester and Norwich and all the York,
which anyway. By the way, is common for virtually every culture that's come here. They all leave their mark, which is kind of makes it kind of nice.
Yep. Exactly.
Okay. Now, what I'd like to talk about initially, when they get there, of course, they're doing all the typical things you would imagine them doing, trying to find their way around and figure out where do we draw our rations from and that sort of thing. But the most immediate problems that the division and the regiment were facing was the health of the soldiers and the shortage of men. Okay, because these guys have been basically in the field since the 8th of November, 1942, in the desert, sometimes under, canvas, many times under the stars, in various types of weather, rain, sleet, snow, whatever, there and in Sicily. And so they've all, I say all, many of them have various and sundry health issues. You got, malaria, jaundice, something called desert ulcers, which the closest I can figure is some kind of staph infection that they're dealing with, and some other things that are problems. And as you might imagine, the division medical personnel kind of go into overdrive trying to figure out how we can get these guys back on their feet and ready to fight the next battle. We got 6 months, 7 months to do that. And so they start looking for ways to treat these soldiers. One of the more common things and more serious things, not surprisingly, was what we've kind of already addressed, this whole idea of shell shock or combat exhaustion. And a good number of men, had these issues that they were dealing with. Now, one of the things that was kind of not uncommon that may surprise some people was that even the soldiers felt that some of these guys were basically malingerers. And so they when a guy started claiming, I got shell shock or whatever, that tended to make them look, other soldiers kind of look down on them in their eyes, and other soldiers that were affected by it kind of kept it inside. They wouldn't tell anybody because they felt kind of ashamed that other guys might think of them that way too, and so they didn't seek any help or anything, which is part of the problem. So again, the medics and doctors kind of had their hands full. There was one incident that I ran across I thought was kind of poignant. It was a lieutenant in the 26th Infantry who decided he couldn't go on. And so one night he puts on his dress uniform, puts on all his ribbons and everything, writes a note, puts his hat on, lays in his bunk, and blows his brains out, leaving the note to explain why he couldn't continue to do this. And of course, many other guys suffered from it. But interestingly enough, some of the other things I've looked at says that was pretty unusual for somebody actually to go to committing suicide, at least during the wartime period. But as you well know, many of these guys suffered from it for the rest of their lives. Others, for a long time afterwards. And there were those that would get to the 1950s and go, I can't deal with this any longer, and they, do themselves in. So, it was clearly a problem. The one of the other things that in addition to the doctors were trying to figure out ways to deal with this, and they were kind of successful. That's where a lot of this process starts to that the basis for it was established in, and many of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that they established then are still being used for PTSD today, which is what we call it today. But another thing that helped quite a bit was just better food. I talked about the soldiers being on the HMS or HMT, His Majesty's Transport, Malosia, and one of their big gripes was the meat. Why? Because it was all mutton, and mutton isn't a big, it's not something you find Americans eating much of, and certainly not American soldiers. And apparently, it was made every which way that you could imagine, and none of which was amenable to the American palate. So that was their biggest complaint in the voyage was, wasn't the weather, it wasn't the rolling of the ship, it was the mutton. So Hubner and Wyman and regimental commanders, they start to work on trying to come up with better food for their soldiers, and they're largely successful in doing that. And in fact, one of the big memorable stories of many soldiers was the Thanksgiving meal. Because for Thanksgiving, they were able to, of course, sure, all this stuff was shipped over from the States more than likely, but they had, a bunch of turkeys and, meat and other delicacies and everything that they hadn't had in a while. And so the Thanksgiving meal was a huge hit for the soldiers, and morale just, the monthly report at the end of the month, they always put a monthly report, and they always talk about what the morale, they gauge the morale, and the morale just kind of soared because of just that one experience. Another problem, of course, was things like the weather. Now, I've heard it told that weather in England can be miserable at times, especially during this time of year. In November through, April, you got rain, you got snow in some places, you got, foggy weather and so forth. Not the most conducive to, happy-go-lucky attitudes and so forth. However, having said that, the thing is that all of these soldiers were finally put into hard billets somewhere. Now, some of those hard billets, let's go ahead. Let's see. Let's go to slide 10 real quick. Some of those places were, hard billets, like Nissen huts or Quonset huts and those type of things. They're built for their purpose and so forth. But in a lot of cases, they were existing structures that the government in Dorset and the people of Dorset willingly allowed the soldiers to occupy. Now, I say willingly. I'm not sure how much coaxing and influence there was from higher levels and so forth. But here's a perfect example. This is the 16th Infantry Regiment headquarters in Parnham House near Beminster. Now, I mean, that if that doesn't qualify as a mansion, I don't know what does. But that's just a beautiful place. Unfortunately, I never got to visit it before it burnt down, and there's a whole story with that I won't get into. But I do plan to go up there and visit it in July. June. I'm going to Bridport in June to do this presentation as well as a D-Day presentation. But I want to get up there to see the Parnham House. But the family still lived there. The regimental headquarters was in one part of the house. They lived in another part of the house. And that was true in any number of other places in Dorset where you had American soldiers living in billets that the family owned. The family was still there. And then you had officers or NCOs or whatever in another part of the house, which is, obviously goes a long way toward building those relationships. Let's go to the next slide real quick.
I mean, just a quick question going about the placement of units. So going back a couple of minutes, it's a really good point. Sean is saying, I understand the placement of units for embarkation for D-Day, but did that cause any issues with useful training areas in those locations? And I'm thinking, before I let you answer, some of the British commando units had done what we would call today Fibua, built up fighting and built up urban areas because they were billeted near London and there were lots of bombed out buildings nearby. So they took advantage of that and that's why they did it. But it does have an impact. Certain areas of the south of coast have forests, some have open plains. So you couldn't just have all the, Joe said, yes, there were waiting lists to go to some of these training places. So it absolutely would have had an impact, wouldn't it?
Yes, although, yes and no. I'll put it this way, and I'll talk more about the training here in a little bit that will better answer the question, I think. But just in short, the training, how do you define training? Well, it's all kind of different. I mean, you're talking about shooting your rifles. Well, you're obviously going to go to an existing range. You're not going to just, go to some farmer's field and start plunking away. There were places, and some of them may have been temporary ranges that were built specifically for that, but all the appropriate safety precautions would have been put in place and that sort of thing. But if we're talking about things like road marches, conditioning marches, squad and platoon tactics, you can go to the local forest and run through there, do that, as long as you're not leaving trash in there and whatever, which they would have made them do, clean all that kind of stuff up. At least they would have told them to do it. Now, whether, they always did it is another question, because, soldiers can be. But, small unit level stuff, I don't think there were any issues. Now, when you start getting into some of the more specific training, like, Bangalore torpedoes or flamethrowers and that stuff, yes, then you had to go to specific locations. And again, I will talk about where those are and what they did here in a little bit. Fair enough?
Yep, great, thanks.
Okay. So now, here's some more examples I threw up. By the way, I did give him credit. Robin Pierce, who I had the pleasure and honor to meet a number of years ago on a previous visit to England, wrote a book called 7 Months to D-Day. You can still get this on Amazon. It's out of print, but it's a lot of what I'm talking about today is in there, and there's a lot of great pictures. I stole these out of his book to give him credit, these pictures here, because he talks about where a lot of people were billeted and how it was done. But here's some examples that I pulled out of Robin's book. Unfortunately, he passed away now, but did a great job. He really has done some great historical work on not just the 1st Division, but the 101st and some other outfits over there. Anyway, Hotel Alexandra in Lyme Regis, that's where the 1st Battalion officers were. You had medics in the home of Colonel Compton. I don't know who Colonel Compton was, but he opened his home to have the medics come in and stay there. You got the special troops officers from the regiment up at Bedminster at the Bridge House and so forth. I mean, you kind of get a feel here. And there were any number of other places where soldiers were stationed in homes and gymnasiums, in places like that where they would have hot showers, bathrooms, a roof over their head and a bed to sleep in. I mean, to them, this was like staying in the Trump Hotel, after being in North Africa in Sicily. This was, glorious for them to be there. So anyway, it's also a good way for people to kind of get to know the people around them. So that again contributes to that relationship. Okay. Let's see here. Yeah, I did all that. I'll talk about these pictures here in a little bit through this part that I'm talking about getting to know England. But needless to say that the doctors trying to get all these guys on their feet and everything, getting them in these billets and everything. These guys, the vast majority of them did get better and did get healthy and so forth. Needless to say, there were others who didn't get well enough to be able to stay in the ranks of the infantry. And so a lot of those guys were reclassified to being, a radio man or maybe even a medic or something, a truck driver. As others were reclassified out of the division totally and put in like quartermaster units or something like that, which created an additional shortage of men. So like I say, the challenge was to get troops in and get them trained up. And I'll give you some examples here. When the division left Sicily, it was way under strength. And E Company, as an example, was at 129 men. Now, normally a rifle company was at 180. So you can see it's a pretty significant difference between 129 and 180. Now, by the time D-Day rolls around, the 2nd Battalion and 3rd Battalion, which are going to be the lead battalions coming in, are going to be up to 220 men. They're going to be overstrength. And the reason why they're actually each one of them, well, I'm kind of biting into my D-Day presentation, but anyway, each one of them were overstrength with an additional assault section, which were really kind of designed to be broken up and doled out to the platoons when they reorganized to bring them up to strength. So they're actually overstrength by the time they get there. By March of 1944, only 4 of the company or the division, the regiment's 27 rifle companies are at full strength. Only 4. So 3 months before D-Day, we're still bringing in troops, trying to get them trained up and integrated into the regiment. So you can see what a challenge this is, not only for General Huebner, because that's going on in all the other regiments as well. It's a challenge for the regimental commander on down to the squad leaders. You're getting these guys in and trained up and prepared. One of the things that causes part of the problem is something called the Army Specialized Training Program, which I don't know if you've run into that before or not. Mm-hmm. But it for your listeners' benefit, it's a program where they basically take kind of the top quality guys and they prepare them to do like technical jobs, like some of the engineer jobs, military intelligence, those types of things. And so by the time you get done moving people into these jobs where they need to have a little bit more skill sets, you're down to what's left over, and those are the guys that end up in the infantry. Now, as an infantryman, I'm not saying, hey, these guys are the dregs of society. What I am saying is that, they are, in fact, most of them became excellent soldiers, maybe for that very reason. If you think too much, you reflect on things like your death too much, you're probably not going to make the best soldier. Some of these guys are about, living life and that sort of thing, and they tend to make pretty damn good soldiers. But if you're going to have disciplinary problems, they're probably going to be in that 10% at the bottom that creates additional, leadership challenges and training challenges that you have to deal with. So I'm just trying to paint a picture here for your listeners.
Well, I'm glad they're doing that because, I mean, we talk about some of these units as if they are like machinery that just needs a good service and oil change. But, the point you made about them coming from overseas with malaria and other ailments and then dietary problems and then the PTSD issues, it's, it's managing of personnel as well as preparing for an invasion. I'm glad you brought it up. Thank you.
If I can share with your listeners with this also, because this is after 27 years in the Army as an infantry officer. I'm an arts kind of guy. Military history and all that kind of stuff, and then you have the kind of science kind of guy. And one of the things I've always felt very frustrated about is a lot of leaders in the military tend to be science guys. They're enamored with technology and everything, but the very things that we're talking about is on the art side. And the challenges that Alexander the Great had in getting tired, hungry soldiers off the ground to attack the hill is no different than a platoon leader has today in getting tired, hungry soldiers off the ground to attack the hill. That doesn't change. And so these types of leadership challenges are universal and forever. And so people who don't understand that, if they don't take that seriously, are going to be less successful in combat if they're just thinking, well, like the Air Force did in World War II, our bombers will solve all the problems. Well, they didn't. That's technology. And I'm not denigrating the Air Force there. I'm just saying technology is a wonderful thing, but it doesn't solve all the problems. So enough of my pontificating there. Like I said, I want to talk a little bit about getting to know England, but let me address some of the initial training things that were going on before I launch into that. General Hubner understood, like I said, he needed to have time to recover, but he also needed to get these guys trained up for the reasons I've already talked about. And they get there initially in November, and it's really low key. In fact, what they're doing in November is kind of just doing more of what they did in Sicily. Okay, so basic training type of stuff. You get to December, and it starts to be ratcheted up. And in December, not only are we doing the basic rifle marksmanship stuff, but he's now got people going out and going to the ranges to fire their 30 and 50 caliber machine guns, the 60 and 81 millimeter mortars. Again, going back to the question earlier, the challenges of getting the troops out to those places where you can fire. You can't just go out to your local farmer's yard and start dropping mortar rounds. So you got to have a range to be able to do that sort of thing. Firing bazookas, the BAR, and all that kind of stuff. That starts to increase dramatically to get people used to using those weapons again. Because it's been a while since they've been in combat, and some of them haven't been in combat at all. They even implement bayonet training to build aggressiveness in the soldiers. So that goes on. And on top of that, they start squad and platoon training, and each platoon, one night a week has to go out and conduct a night training problem somewhere in the local area. So that's out in the local woods, where you don't have to reserve it or anything. You just go out and you conduct a patrol, or you make a simulated attack on that little hill over there, or whatever. But they do it ad hoc, and the purpose is to get these guys used to working together and using their own internal standard operating procedures, how that platoon or that company operates. So that starts picking up in December, and the training tempo is going to increase even more after that. Now, back to, okay, we need to let these guys have let their hair down a little bit and have a little fun. So they start finding things for soldiers to do, and they're able to get, for the whole division, this is again across the board, things, simple things like ping pong tables, pool tables. They set up movie theaters. They even build these battalion libraries in each of the three battalion areas, which I'm sure is going on. And that's books that people have donated from the States, that the British are donating, and so forth. So they have something to read for those guys who are, more academically inclined or whatever. They even are allowed to go on tours. So you have soldiers, hopping on a bus and going on a tour to London or Edinburgh or some other place. I'm sure Stonehenge was one place that they relatively nearby that they got to go see, and so forth. And I have kind of one of my a neat story about a tour that I want to share. It's not really so much about the tour, but again, I'm going to talk about a guy named Samuel Fuller, which some of your listeners may know. But Fuller, if you don't know, was the movie director and producer and writer of the Lee Marvin movie, The Big Red One.
Yep.
and he was a corporal in F Company, and I think by this time he's actually up at the 2nd Battalion headquarters at this point in the war. But he had been in Hollywood before the war, and while he was there in Bridport, he meets a lady and gets to know her, and her name is Mrs. Gibbs, and she's a local grocery store owner. And he'd come in there to buy, cigarettes or whatever was available, and he got to talking with her, and they became friends. And she asked him, she said, "Well, Corporal Fuller, what was it that you did before you became a soldier?" And Fuller says, "Well, I was a screenwriter in Hollywood." And she goes, "Oh, really? I have a nephew who's in the movie business." And Fuller goes, "Well, really? Who's that?" And she goes, "Oh no, he didn't even ask who it was." She goes, "His name is Hitchcock." And Fuller gets his eyes real big, and he goes, "You mean Alfred Hitchcock?" And she said, "Well, yes." Yeah. And he goes, "I know who he is. I really, I'm very impressed with his work." And she goes, "Well, I'll arrange for you to meet him." So he gets on one of these tours to go to London, and he makes time to link up with Alfred Hitchcock at a place called the Claridge Hotel. I don't know if that's a big deal in London anymore.
It is, yep. Still is, yep. Yeah.
And at the time, it was a big deal. And so he meets Alfred Hitchcock at the Claridge. And the initial meeting does not go well. At least the initial part of the meeting doesn't go well, because they sit down and they shake hands. Hey, they do the glad hand thing. And so Hitchcock goes, "Well, Sammy, what's your unit and where are you stationed?" Well, Fuller had been, "Don't tell anybody anything. We're not the 1st Division and so forth." So Fuller tells Hitchcock, "Mr. Hitchcock, if I told you that, I could be executed, and you could be executed just for asking the question." He said that Hitchcock's face turns white and he's mortified. And he goes, "Oh, wait a minute. Look, what I'm really here to meet with you about is to try and get you to come. I'm here working on propaganda films for the Americans and the British, and I wanted to get you over to help do that." And he goes, "Well, look, I joined the Army to get this experience, and I want to see this thing through." He said, "But I tell you what. Would you be willing to look at some of my screenplays if I send them to you to kind of give me your thoughts and opinions on them?" Hitchcock says, "Oh yeah, absolutely." So the kind of meeting went on from there. And needless to say, they, after the war, they never did cooperate on a film, but they did stay friends and met each other on numerous occasions. And of course, one of the things that pops up is a story, with other folks around, was this initial meeting and how it kind of starts off on a rocky road. But anyway, I thought that was good. And by the way, that story comes out of Fuller's book, The Third Face, which I would also recommend.
And Fuller is a brilliant example of what you were saying earlier, Stephen, about a guy who carried that war in his head for the rest of his life. I mean, not just making movies, but dealing with the concentration camps. And, that I don't know that he necessarily suffered from PTSD, but it certainly never left him. He was tormented, obsessed. I mean, we had Marsha Gordon on a couple of years ago who wrote the book about his movies, and we talked a lot about his problems, his issues, his trauma.
Well, I tell you, you're right about that. He was a lifetime member of our association, 16th Infantry Regiment Association, as well as the Society of the 1st Division. One thing that a lot of people don't know about him, and he went on to make a whole bunch of movies, to include Breakthrough and some other war movies. He also made a whole bunch of cowboy movies.
Yeah.
But apparently, and I've seen this evidence to a degree, I haven't seen all his movies, but supposedly every one of his movies, including his Westerns, somewhere in the movie, there's a 1st Infantry Division patch.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, it just kind of tells you how, and he used to attend the annual reunion every year as well. So it was very much part of his, his persona, and it was in his blood. In fact, just last year, we inducted his daughter, Samantha, as an honorary member of the regiment of the 16th Infantry, because of his ties to the 16th Infantry and everything. But she made a wonderful documentary about her father.
Yeah.
I don't know how hard it is for people to find, but we often show it at our reunions to kind of get people familiar with who Sammy Fuller is. Okay, so I just want to share that story with you. One other thing, again, as a sidebar, because I think it's kind of fascinating. Here in the States, when you see World War II movies, or you see Vietnam movies, and you see a division patch, or see a really any patch, it's 90% of the time it's either going to be the 1st Cavalry Division, the 101st Airborne Division, or maybe the 82nd Airborne Division. Rarely do you see the 1st Division patch. In fact, Saving Private Ryan, you see that, and Joe will love this. It's the 29th Division, right? Now, you do see 1 or 2 1st Division patches in there, but 9 times out of 10 you rarely see the 1st Division patch in American shows. However, my wife and I like to watch something called BritBox, which is all British shows. They're from all over the UK, and I've noticed that in British shows, more often than not, way more often than not, if you see a 1st Division patch, to see a American Division patch, it's going to be the 1st Division. Midsummer Murders, for example, there's an episode where there's this dance going on, a World War II dance with the Glenn Miller music and everything. There's a bunch of several U.S. soldiers in there dressed as people dressed as, it's a costume party, and they're all wearing the 1st Division patch. Foils War, there's several episodes that has 1st Division guys in it. So I just find that kind of being fascinating and somewhat gratifying that the British still like to think about the 1st Division. Thank you very much. Okay, enough of that.
You're very welcome. On behalf of the nation, you're very welcome.
Okay. Now I'll talk about this next slide. As American soldiers are even today, one of the big things they love, of course, is sports. I suspect that's probably true for British soldiers too. And of course, that was one of the biggest sources of relaxation and entertainment and so forth. And so in the 1st Division, they formed all these different sports teams. They do football, which of course is American football, not soccer or British football, which, as I understand it, is probably as undecipherable to a lot of British observers as cricket is to Americans. But basketball, baseball, softball, even marksmanship, boxing, and so forth. The 16th Infantry Regiment, by the way, won the division basketball and boxing titles. And that picture you see there of those basketball players, those are the 1st Division basketball champions that won the championship there. And of course, at all these sporting events, they had all kinds of British citizens showing up to watch all this stuff, and I'm sure that's where they first get confused with football. Interestingly enough, one of the favorite pastimes of soldiers, and maybe not surprisingly given the venue, is playing darts in the local pub. A lot of guys mentioned this dart playing. And of course, what they really like doing was drinking the beer or whiskey or whatever they were doing. And that's how a lot of them really kind of get to know, the locals and so forth, and make friends with them. Now, as always, soldiers can be kind of rowdy, and the 1st Division had its reputation of being rowdy there in North Africa and all. We talked about how they were kept out of the places in North Africa and so forth. So when they get to England, Hubner and Colonel Taylor, the regimental commander, made it known, hey, we're not going to tolerate anything like that. So you either on your best behavior. They had certain restrictions, which mostly were security type stuff. But in other words, they were saying, okay, you can go out and hit the local, communities and meet people and so forth. But when you start showing you can't be trusted, you're going to be restricted to your areas. And so they took that to heart. And although there were fights, between soldiers from time to time, usually from different units, fights between an American soldier and a British citizen were rare. Very few, that at least in the 1st Division area, definitely in the 16th Infantry area. And I'll give you an example of how all this kind of comes together in terms of relationships. Major Techmeyer talks about an incident in his book where this 3 soldiers from another unit wander into Bedminster, I think it is. It might have been Bridport, but I think it's Bedminster. And they ask for some whiskey. And the proprietor there says, we don't have any. And one of them points to a bottle and says, what the hell you mean? There's a bottle right there full of whiskey. And they start getting loud and abusive and everything. And the publican calms them down. And he says, specifically, he says, all of our whiskey is being saved for the 16th Infantry. They're not only soldiers, but they're gentlemen. Now get the hell out of here. And he kicks them out of the pub and it won't let them back in. So that again, I mean, how prevalent that was across the board, I don't know, but at least in that pub, if you were a 16th Infantry guy, you were welcome. Now, again, for your listeners' benefit, to explain, that's not as simple as it sounds, because like so many things in England at this time and UK in general, is all the stuff is rationed. You know, you
Yep.
can only get so much beer, you can only get so much whiskey and whatever else is available, and they have to share that with the local American soldiers.
Yep.
So they're cutting out what they would normally be able to drink to allow the American soldiers to have a few drinks as well. And of course, as you might imagine, that goes a long way with the American, because they figured that out pretty quick. You know that, hey, you know, we're drinking their stuff, and so they really did appreciate that.
Well, there's that. It's on YouTube. There's the training film with Burgess Meredith, Made in the War, about how to act when you go to the UK. You know, it's aimed at American soldiers arriving in England, and it says things like, don't give if you give presents to the English people or British people, make sure you insist you don't expect something back, because you'd give something to them, then the British would then feel obligated to give something back, but it was from rations they couldn't spare. So they looked at this, you know, the powers that be looked at this and realized the American soldiers had more money. They realized they had, you know, cigarettes sort of not necessarily to spare, but they had them in their rations, and so they thought about how these relationships would go. And you know, I grew up in East Anglia, where it's all the 8th Air Force, and lots of care was taken about making sure that both sets of people, the locals and the visitors, understood the difficulties being faced by the others. And I think on the whole, you know, we talk about FDR and Churchill's great relationship, but bar a very few occasions, I think American troops and British troops and civilians got on pretty damn well in World War II.
Well, that's certainly been my impression based on what I've read, and especially all the World War II vets that I've known in the association. They all, to a man, they talk about you know, what a wonderful time they had in England, and I'll talk a little bit about more of that here in just a minute.
Yeah.
But so you know, in rationing all that stuff, well, the soldiers, you know, when they first get there and they start making friends, you know, they, you know, I talked about the mutton and everything. Well, as you just talked there, you know, you'd have people that would get to know a soldier or a couple of soldiers or a group of soldiers, and they invite them to their home for a meal or whatever. And these soldiers would realize very quickly that you know, these guys, you know, they don't really have a lot to share here, you know, and they realized very quickly that they were going out of their way to just feed them a meal. And so that's where you start to see these guys, you know, doing things like taking food out of the mess hall and taking them to families, you know, taking stuff out of their sea rations. I talk about cigarettes and candy for the kids and all that kind of stuff. You know, that was very common. And I suspect you're exactly right based on that. And I'm sure they saw these films, you know, you know, tell them, don't expect, you know, we don't expect anything back. Please just this, you know, and there was, you know, quite a bit of that. In these, I talked about the Thanksgiving meal. Well, you know, Thanksgiving, we realize it's not an English thing, but you know, Christmas and New Year's is, and in most of those cases, a lot of the locals were invited to come to the Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's meals, you know, to share in it. And for example, the one I ran across that gave some details, what happened in Beminster, and they had it at a place called the Public Hall, which I presume is like what we call the City Hall, I suppose, or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, and so they had a huge amount of turkeys and some other meat. They had you know, roast chicken. They had ham. They had apple pie, ice cream, all kinds of stuff that really none of them had. I say none of them, the soldiers hadn't had in a while. And they invited people to come in, and there was so much that was left over that some of the locals were going home with stuff. They were taking it with them and everything. And of course, as you imagine, that, you know, again, cements this outstanding relationship that is building here. Again, I talk about the end of month reports. Well, the end of 1943 report, it says morale good, food excellent. So you're starting to see, even in the reports, that things are starting to improve and build and so forth. Now, that isn't to say everything was all hunky dory all 100% of the time. There were points of irritation hither and yon. And, you know, for example, the First Division, where was it before World War II? It was in right around the New York City area. Or at least most of it was. And there was a whole lot of New York City guys still in the First Infantry Division. And New York guys are known for being loud, swaggering, you know, loudmouths, you know, braggadocio and stuff. And I can say that because I'm a Texan and we are too, you know. And so, you know, around these people from Dorset, that type of thing can kind of wear on people who are typically kind of quiet and dignified, you know, to hear somebody talk about how, you know, what a big badass they are or whatever, you know. So that could kind of irritate people. Um, but also, you know, I talked about, you know, getting to know England and entertainment and relaxation. Well, dances were a big thing, which is my next picture there. You'll see that says the Regimental Jazz Band. Those guys are infantry soldiers that happen to know how to play an instrument, and they put together this jazz band so they could put on dances and stuff. Now, they weren't the only ones who put on dances. You had the local population that would put on dances in these different communities. You even had what's called NAFI, and I had to look that up. The National Army, National Navy, the Navy Army and Army Institutes, NAFI.
Yep.
They would put on dances and so forth. I guess that still exists too.
It does.
So they'd all host dances, and of course, you know, naturally you have a bunch of young male soldiers and the young, you know, female ladies that come to the dances, and those could be, you know, naturally the soldiers don't want to make, you know, give the girls a lot of attention, and the girls are giving a lot of attention back. And, you know, for some guys around the local area, that would be points of contention, particularly if they happen to be hitting on their girlfriend or whatever. But you know, and it was, you know, to carry the story further, was not uncommon for, you know, a couple of these kids to fall in love and eventually get married. In fact, there were a number of people, you know, that did get married before D-Day, and unfortunately, some of them were killed in action on D-Day and left them widows. And others, you know, of course, you know, marry later in the war and you know, bring their wives back to the state and so forth. But the sharing of things like the booze and the pursuit of the girls and all that kind of stuff kind of you know, led to that famous quote in a book that people in England would say a three-part complaint. You know, their Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. So that was very true in the First Division area as well, I'm sure. But on the whole, these relationships were really outstanding. In fact, I want to read a couple of comments from people in their memoirs that I'd like to share with your readers. First one's from Major Techmar again, and this is what he wrote. He said, Colonel Taylor and the rest of us on the staff were considerably worried about how our men would respond to civilization. We anticipated some disorder and drunkenness, so wisely the old man issued only one order that was decreed by higher headquarters to all the units. The men were not allowed to go outside of the designated area, and they were given freedom of action, which would not be curtailed until their behavior justified official interference. In our 7 months in England, to our amazement, the command never had to interfere. The behavior of our men was exemplary, and we blushed with embarrassed pleasure when British officials and civilians told us that our soldiers were the most best behaved soldiers, British, Allied, or American, that they ever encountered. And then he goes on to add, I wish they would have put that statement in writing and forwarded it to General Patton. Another guy, Tech Sergeant Donald Wilson, who wrote a brief memoir that I thought was pretty good. He was stationed out at West Bay, which is near Bridport. And he wrote, I recall a particular sadness when we left. It was a deeper, more painful feeling than I had when I left Penn Station in New York 2 years before. I would miss the little harbor, the quaint cottages with their tiny gardens, the West Bay Hotel with its piano and dartboard, and above all, I would miss the British people, young and old, who treated us so well. So that kind of sums up that relationship and that experience, as I mentioned to you about 16 soldiers that I heard from all of them. Okay, let's go on to training for D-Day. Now, in January, in addition to the continued training with us, ranges and so forth, they now start into things like fortified assault of fortified positions, the very types of things they're going to start to see in D-Day. They also start doing a whole bunch of conditioning marches. let's see, what are we on 12 here? Okay. And some of those marches would go as long as 50 miles. Now, they wouldn't do them all in one day, obviously, but it would be over 2-3 day period to get these guys ready for what they would, find in France, because they're going to have to do a hell of a lot of walking in France. They're not, at least initially, they're not going to do a lot of riding on trucks and so forth. So they're getting them ready for that sort of thing. The battalion headquarters started holding a battalion command post exercises to start getting used to using tactical radio procedures and functioning in a tactical environment again, because it's been a while since these guys have been doing that, and that was actually in preparation for a CPX coming up in February for the regiment. The highlight of the month probably, I guess, was a regimental formation that was held on the 16th of February in at the Bridport Cricket Grounds, when General Sir Bernard Montgomery came to talk to the entire regiment. They had the whole regiment up there, and he talked to them. And he wouldn't be the first or the only guy to come talk to them. There'll be a couple others that come later that I'll talk about. In addition to that, we start to see training in February, beginning on the 4th. Well, that was when the CPX was held. The regimental CPX was held. Again, it's not now designed to make the connections between the regiment down to the battalion, down to the company, and probably down to as low as the platoon level, radio procedures and using encoded language and all that kind of stuff. On the 8th of February, the regiment travels to Braunton, and you see that slide there up just south of Bristol Channel there in the west, where the U.S. Army Assault Training Center is there. And that's where you start seeing a lot more of the complicated type weapons training going on. And so, yes, they have specific areas that are designed for that. And yes, you have to, some units have difficulty getting in there because they don't have the priority like the 1st Division and the 29th Division do. They're going in first. They're obviously going to get priority and going there. So they end up going there, and there they do make attacks against, strong points and fortified positions. They actually start doing like preliminary beachhead operations, and they start doing live work with demolitions, Bangalore torpedoes, flamethrowers, bazookas, all those types of weapons that you can't do in and around the Dorset area. The exercise there at Braunton was capped off by a battalion landing exercise. And a couple of days later, after they finish that, they go back to Dorset and go back to the process of all the other training that they were doing in preparation for the next big exercise, which is known as Exercise Fox, that's going to be held on the 11th of March. Now, before they go to Fox, though, planning for Fox begins well before that. Back during the time that they're at Braunton, Colonel Taylor and Major Carl Plitt, who's the battalion operations officer, are called to the 1st Division headquarters over to the east there, and they are issued the draft order of what will become Operation Neptune, and they're briefed on it. And from that point onward, everything they do is geared toward that particular mission. Okay, and now the officers in certain NCOs are going to be made aware of some of the details in that, but the troops themselves aren't going to know any of that other than what they see in the training that they're doing until they get to the D camps. Now, on the 8th of March, let's see, I want to go to the next slide, I think. Slide.
Yep.
Yeah. Let me see if I'm on track here. What slide is 14? Yeah. Well, anyway, the what happens and what the significance of this slide is that this is a picture of Parnham House from another different angle. But that attic window that you see, that whole area up there is where the Regimental Operations Center was. And so all the planning for D-Day is going to take place in that area. And it's all secured. They got guards on it 24 hours a day and everything. And they bring the battalion staffs in there to poop them up on their roles and missions and so forth. So that sees a lot of activity obviously prior to D-Day. All right. Some of the things that they're looking at, by the way, are things such as not just the field order, what becomes the field order 35, which is the ops order, the division op order, or maybe it's the corps op order. I can't remember. But they start seeing the aerial photographs that have been taken. There's a series of aerial reconnaissances flying over that they take pictures of, and I'll just kind of give a heads up here to your listeners that what's amazing about D-Day is the amount of work that the Germans get done from April of 44 to June of 44. It's astounding what they were able to accomplish. And so a lot of what they're seeing initially in these aerial photographs isn't what they're going to see on D-Day. It's a lot cleaner than what they're going to run into. But the Bigot maps are a series of maps that show all these obstacles. And as they get additional information, they upgrade them and update them with the details. So they're getting to see those as well. All right. Let's go ahead and move to slide 15 there. Okay. So the next operation is Operation Fox, I talked about. And at this point, you're starting to see the regiment form into combat teams. And I explained this during the Sicily presentation, but I'd like to rehash it here for your listeners. You hear the term regimental combat team a lot. And, technically a regimental combat team is a separate, it's a non-divisional RCT, regimental combat team. Within a division, they're just known as a combat team. So when you see the 1st Division, for example, you're going to see Combat Team 16, Combat Team 18, Combat Team 26, as opposed to RCT and whatever. And they start organizing into a combat team. So what is that? Typically, you have a field artillery, direct supports field artillery battalion, at least one engineer battalion, a medical, engineer company, and a medical company from the division medical battalion. And then for D-Day itself, there will be other attachments that they're not working with yet, but they will. And that's the standard combat team configuration. So that's when I refer to a combat team, that's what you're typically seeing. So the regiment moves down to Weymouth on the 8th of March, and there they board the USS Barnett, which is not one of the ships that they're going to do for D-Day, but they go through a series of boat drills and so forth, while some of the officers are getting pooped up on some of the amphibious aspects of D-Day. And and then when they complete all of that, they move out from Weymouth Harbor and they head over to Slapton Sands that you see there in the lower part of the slide. And on the 11th of March, they actually conduct an amphibious operation at Slapton Sands. Now, the landings go very smoothly. There's, it's obviously, there's some differences here. Obviously, nobody's shooting back at them, for example. There's no live firing on their side either. No demolitions. But probably the major thing that's kind of odd is that for some reason or other, the 116th Infantry goes in on the left of the 16th Infantry. Now on D-Day, it's going to be just the opposite. 16th is going to go on the left, and the 116th is going to go right on the right. And I don't know if Joe knows the answer to that question, why that is or not. I've never run across why they did it that way initially, but that was the plan then. It's not going to happen that way on D-Day. After they finish up Fox, they go back to Dorset once again to their areas. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. And they continue their training for D-Day. The first picture that you see there, I threw that up there. It really goes back earlier, but I wanted to put it up here. It shows these guys. These guys are in an assault team, not in a platoon. And an assault team is different. That I'll explain what that means for the purposes of D-Day here in a little bit. But they're out on a conditioning march somewhere. And they show up at the London Inn, and they're shaking the hands with the publican there. But what I find curious about this is if you look really closely, it's going to be kind of hard for your guys to see. But particularly if you look at the sergeant standing there on the right with the grand on his shoulder, you'll see above his chevrons a big red 1 patch. apparently at some point they decided, this idea about trying to keep secrecy as who we are is probably out the window. And so they've already, at this point, this is probably, I'm guessing, April or May. It's obviously a nice day. And they've sewed their division patches on at this point. Okay. So as we get into April, they're preparing for the next big major operation, which is exercise Fabius 1. You can go to the next slide. Okay, and this shows you kind of where things happen there. Initially, of course, this time when they do the landings at Slapton, the regiments are going to go on the appropriate location where they're going to do for D-Day. You got the 16th on the left, the 116th on the right. But they initially move out from their billeting areas. They get to what is essentially a D camp at Martinstown that you see circled there. They go through a series of training exercises there and planning and preparation. And while they're there, something happens that probably I have very little doubt, probably kind of shook people a little bit. But on the night of the 27th and 28th of April, there's an exercise for the 4th Infantry Division going on called Exercise Tiger. And they're kind of going through the same process that the 1st Division at this point. And what happens is a bunch of German E-boats make it across the English Channel and get in amongst the landing ships of the 4th Infantry Division, and they start shooting them up. And apparently they didn't realize that there weren't any warships in there. So they could have done a whole lot more damage than they did, but they shot up what they could and then departed. In the process, they sink a couple of ships, and about 749 soldiers and sailors die that night in that attack. Another 300 or so are wounded. And the damage is bad enough that, and they were the 4th Division engineers, and the damage was bad enough that they actually had to substitute another engineer battalion and get them ready for D-Day because the 4th Battalion was shot up so badly. Anyway, the 1st Division's training continues. They head off to Slapton Sands on the 1st of May, and on the 4th of May, they conduct their landings. It goes off about 7:30 in the morning, which is about an hour later what they're going to do on D-Day. Landings once again would go very smoothly, although the seas were a little rough and a little rainy and so forth. And they're able to get to their day's objectives once again because nobody's shooting at them. But it goes off very well. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some images from that training exercise, with the exception of the picture up to the upper right. That's the USS Henrico. It's one of the two ships, or one of the three ships actually, that the regiment will take to D-Day. The Samuel Chase being another one up in the upper right there. And then the other pictures that you see are all part of the training there at Slapton Sands for Fabius 1. Kind of give you a feel for it. That picture there, the Samuel Chase, I'm not sure that's really at Slapton Sands. I mean, it doesn't look too rough seas there to me. That's probably when they're still at Weymouth and going through some training there, but whatever. But that's the ship that they take. Okay. On the 7th of May, they arrive back in their areas at Dorset, and they go through the process of final preparations, waterproofing vehicles, packing and crating in their equipment. They start putting the vehicle marking back on their vehicles. And that may be when they started sewing the patches back on again, too. It's probably likely that's when it happened. And then they do a general cleanup of all the camps, because when they leave those camps, other units are going to move in there to occupy, and they don't want to leave a bunch of trash and that sort of thing. On the 17th of May, and we can go to the next slide, I think. Yep. They move to their marshalling camps, or the D camps, as they're known. To position them to better boarding at Weymouth Harbor. And they move into 3 camps, and you can see them circled there, D10, D8, and D4. And I understand now that there probably were a couple of others where some elements of the 16th, D11 and 12, which are kind of between what you see there, D8 and D10 along that road somewhere, which are not on the map. But anyway, they get to the D camps, and of course, the cleanup of the camps and the marking, and now going to these marshalling camps, that's kind of the first real indicator that, hey, the big show is coming up here. Even so, at this point, the soldiers are still allowed to go out and go to the local pubs and play darts or whatever. So their movements aren't heavily restricted at this point. It's at this point, however, in the D camps where the company commanders and their platoon leaders and selected NCOs get to start viewing their roles in D-Day. And you can go to the next slide. And this picture shows Captain Victor Briggs and the seat company officers, and I think there's a couple of NCOs in there at D4, I think it is, where they're starting to go over their part of the D-Day plan. Of course, again, the soldiers aren't privy to all this yet, but these guys are starting to learn for the first time what they're going to be doing. On the 24th of May, that's when the camps get locked down and the access in and out is very severely restricted. The only people going out now are, people to go pick up rations or, officers going to division headquarters to, coordination or whatever. And on the 26th of May, 2 days later, is the first time the soldiers themselves learn what their mission is on D-Day. So that's the first time they learn about what they're going to be doing. The very next day, they moved to D4. The whole regiment moved to D4, go through the final planning process, the final briefings, briefbacks, what we call rock drills and that sort of thing. And they reorganize into their final assault team configurations, and they're billeted that way. Now, I said I wanted to talk briefly about what an assault team is. The standard infantry company at this point has 3 line platoons and 1 weapons platoon, and it's 180 guys. Second, third battalions, because they're elite assault battalions, are reorganized into 6 assault teams, and the assault teams are very specialized. Each team has a machine gun team, a mortar team, a bazooka team, a Bangalore team, and commo team, and some other specialized team. There's only 2 or 3 guys in each one, 4 guys maybe in some cases, but they're about 30 to 35 guys, and they're designed to fit on an LCVP or an LCA in the case of the 3rd Battalion, which are British landing craft. Yep. They're the equivalent. And again, for your listeners, they know the difference. LCAs are heavily armored, which the LCVPs, the only thing that's armored on them is the front ramp. Okay, so and putting the 3rd Battalion in LCAs, that gave them a lot more protection. The idea was that they would suffer fewer casualties going in. More to follow that on D-Day. Anyway, so they're going through. They're billeted in their assault sections and so forth. Of course, they've been training in these assault sections, but this is their final configuration, and again, they're going through back briefs, as you might imagine, just like Lee Marvin did on. I can't remember the name of the movie now, where they're parachuting in the German to kill the German officers.
Dirty Dozen, yeah.
There you go. The Dirty Dozen, same type of thing. They're going through all that same type of stuff. So anyway, on the 31st, they're moved to Weymouth and Portland. At Weymouth, the 2nd Battalion landing team, or correction, 2nd Battalion landing team in the advanced CP move to the USS Henrico at Portland. They're going to move out of Portland. And the other 2 battalions in the regimental headquarters are going to come out or board at Weymouth and come out of Weymouth to go to Omaha Beach. And they remain on board for the next 6 days, and if soldiers, they get bored real easy, and they're fidgeting, and they're, the only thing they had to do is clean the rifles and write letters and play dice and cards and lose their money or whatever. But a lot of them end up going up on the top side to take a look at the harbor and everything. And one of them, the same guy, Tech Sergeant Nelson, that we talked about earlier, records this in his memoir. He says, it was truly massive, talking about the ships in the harbor and everything. And it occurred to me that this same scene must be taking place in a number of other British seaports. That it was happening in broad daylight and not really far from Fortress Europe was absolutely astounding. Surely they must know, but where were they? Surveying this panorama convinced me that victory would ultimately and unquestionably be ours. And of course, that was a pretty good assessment.
Yeah.
Finally, the signal came to the ships, as you well know, on the 2100, 5th of June. and they steamed out of the harbor in kind of a storm and started assembling in the North Sea. And the rest of the story will have to wait till the next time about D-Day. So that's it. Any other questions that I have?
There's a few questions. I mean, brilliant stuff, by the way, Stephen. Absolutely masterclass. But the questions that came up, with Joe yesterday, we acknowledged that they have trained these guys to get out of landing craft to a completely, incredible degree. That's what they've been doing for weeks and weeks and weeks. And same applies to the First Division. All that embarkation, disembarkation, getting off the beach, clearing those bunkers, Bangalore torpedoes, bazookas, all that kind of stuff. Now, Joe conceded yesterday that he felt that meant the 29th were not as prepared for what they were going to find off the beach, hedgerows, bocage, fighting through villages, hills. What's your verdict on the first? Now, of course, the first have been there and done it. A core percentage of these guys have done Sicily, but was there maybe too much focus on that first day and not enough on the next?
Well,
I know that's a big question.
Well, no, the simple answer on the second part of that is that, absolutely. I mean, but what happens to both the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division in terms of their plan for where they were going to be on certain objective lines, which I would talk about in the next presentation.
Yeah,
it all stems from what the expectations were at the beach line.
Yeah.
And I talk about that quite a bit. I talk about what are the expectations? What are these soldiers? What are these officers being told to expect on Omaha Beach? And what they find on Omaha Beach is not what they're expecting. Okay. Yes, they expect barbed wire. Yes, they expect, strong points and so forth. But when you look at what they're being told is going to happen, and you probably will know this very well, in essence, they were kind of being told, well, with everything that we're going to do you're just going to walk up, and
Navy and Air Force go do their job. Yeah.
Now the bocage is a different story. I mean, nobody picked up on that, right? But as far as getting to their initial objectives and so forth, and as you know as well, the 352nd Infantry Division, Germans, they weren't expecting those guys to be there. And they impacted both the 29th. In fact, they impacted a number of places, but especially the 29th and the 1st Infantry Division. So, the amazing thing, the thing that I would say and this is not my profundity or my brilliance, it's what I've read and agree with from people who came before me, is that what makes D-Day a success are the riflemen who were trained to do missions that, even though they didn't do it over here, they accomplished it over here. Yeah. And if the lieutenant gets killed, the sergeant picks up. The sergeant gets killed, the corporal picks it up. And you have a whole bunch of young men taking the initiative without a whole lot of direction from colonels and captains and majors, and doing it and making it happen anyway. That's what makes D-Day successful. That's why we get to the bluffs and get inland.
And it's interesting that it seems from what Joe said yesterday tonight is that the 29th and the 1st kind of started in different places. I mean, it's clear, we said at the beginning that the 1st have been out there learning on the job. The 29th have been reaping the rewards of some of the lessons being learned elsewhere, but they're in England. And yet they take a different route, but they kind of get to the same objective in the same place. It all comes down to a core trust and ability of small units of men, because those skills are ultimately transferable, aren't they? If lieutenant, sergeant, NCOs, and private soldiers work together as a cohesive unit, you can take that into the desert, the hills, and you have to then adapt it a little bit, but the key principles are there, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's just their old adage, the plan never survives first contact, and that's almost universally true. But the challenge is, okay, what do you do now, Ranger? If you've got people who can think on their feet, have initiative, have been trained, and work well together. I mean, that's the whole idea behind that assault team, is these guys have been working together literally for 7 months, and especially for the last couple, they knew each other, they knew their strengths, their weaknesses, and so forth. And even though they lose casualties, they still move forward and make it happen.
Yeah.
And that's the I think that is the strength of most Western armies compared to a lot of other armies around the world, is that we have the trust and confidence in our junior soldiers to take the initiative.
Yeah.
When the leaders can't be there because they're either killed or out of communications or they're cut off, they pick up and they make it happen anyway. And that's the way we train.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth remembering that the 29th, the 1st, along with the British units that are assaulting the beaches, there's a stack loads more of divisions coming in behind them. Their primary purpose is seize that beachhead. So there are other, as you said on the map, the 9th, the 90th, the 83rd, the 79th, they're all going to come in later on. And I'm thinking, to play kind of devil's advocate here, yes, clearly there was not enough understanding of the bocage, although it's been set in a sidebar there. The Allied planners knew about the bocage. It's just that information had not been spread down to those who would need it. If you were G.I. Smith in the 16th Infantry, you didn't know about the hedgerows. But yes, Eisenhower knew about them. But anyway, that concept of if the first had been spending a week doing urban warfare, a week doing taking high positions, a week doing river crosses, a week doing this, that probably would have reduced their efficiency at doing what they did do, which is assaulting a beach. You can't be good at everything. You have to focus, don't you?
Yeah, well, just looking at the 1st Division, I'm sure this is true within the 29th, and you're probably well aware that 116th was under 1st Division control.
Yep.
Until some point later in the day when the division commander comes forward and actually takes control and so forth. But that was all by design. But the 16th, it was understood. That's why we had these extra assault sections that I talked about, and they were overstrength, is that they were going to take a lot of casualties. Now, they took more than they anticipated, but the idea was that who do you have coming in after that? The 18th Infantry, the 26th Infantry, fresh regiments. They get to the bluffs, without any problems in theory, because the 16th has already taken them. They move forward and they pick up the fight. And then at some point, 2nd Division comes in behind them, and they may either move to take over the 29th Division sector or the 1st Division sector, whichever one's having the most difficulty and the most casualties and so forth. And they, as a 1st Division, they pick up the fight and continue to move forward. That's the basic concept of how that was supposed to happen. Because of the problems that happened on the beach, the 16th Infantry's initial objectives, or at least for one battalion, was even further out from Colleville than Colleville. But ultimately, the 1st Infantry Division doesn't get to their D-Day objective line until like day 3 or day 4, when they finally get up to that line, and that's mostly with fresh units fighting the fight, due to things like the bocage and the fact that you got the 352nd Infantry Division there that they didn't expect.
Well, what we should probably do in June then is what were the expectations of the 16th and the other regiments on D-Day, and what did they achieve and what didn't they, and maybe bust some myths, because everybody has an ownership of D-Day now, post Saving Private Ryan, post video games, post the hundreds of books that come out on that subject every bloody week, seemingly, half of which aren't worth the paper they're printed on. People have an idea of what was supposed to happen and so let's sort of take it back to basics of what actually was intended. What was in those operational orders? Was it order 35, I think you said earlier? What were they? Because let's take it back down to basics, basically boil it down. That would be a really good show.
Okay, well, let's we'll talk, and I can kind of give you an idea that I've come up with based on your recommendation.
But let's do that then. Well, folks, it's been a fantastic show. Thanks for all your questions. We didn't get to all of them, but we've been here for a fair old time. I'm back again on Monday. 3 shows on Monday. David Stahl is doing part 2 about German generals in the Eastern Front. We've got mostly starting on Monte Cassino week. Next year, we've got Alan Allport on. We've got Frank DePlanter on. So we've got tank battles. We've got air power. We've got a whole lot of stuff at Italy in 44 coming up your way. Click like and subscribe. Always visit my guests' websites, etc., etc., etc. But this is Paul for World War II TV saying I will see you all again on Monday. And just for everybody, Let's hope that Ipswich beat Huddersfield tomorrow and get promoted back to the Premier League. Yes, that's what we want, promotion. Yeah, thanks everybody. Cheers. See you on Monday. Bye.